I found out what my mother had done on a Tuesday morning, 7 days before my wedding, at 8:23 in the morning, standing in the middle of my soon-to-be mother-in-law's kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel's younger brother, Theo, who had no idea he was about to detonate the quietest kind of bomb. He'd written, "Hey, just so you know, there's been some talk. Your mom called the house last night. Thought you should know before Saturday." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the granite counter, very carefully. The way you set something down when your hands aren't entirely steady, but you absolutely refuse to let anyone see that. Then I picked up my coffee and took a sip, and I looked out the window at the November light coming through the bare oak trees in the yard, and I thought, she actually did it. She actually went there. I was 31 years old. My name is Caroline Marsh. Soon to be Caroline Marsh Vega, in 6 days, in a ceremony I had spent 14 months planning at a restored farmhouse venue outside of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I had a career I'd built from nothing. 7 years as a forensic accountant, first with a mid-sized firm in Raleigh, and then on my own, with a client list that had taken me 4 years to grow. I had a 2-bedroom apartment in a building with big windows and good light, a kitchen I actually used, and a man who had spent 3 years proving to me in small and consistent ways that he was exactly who he said he was. Daniel Vega, 34 years old, a structural engineer with a laugh that you could hear from the next room, and a patience for difficult situations that I had noticed long before I let myself love him. And now my mother, Margaret Elaine Marsh, 63 years old, 3 times divorced, living in a single-story house in Mabane with a dog she named after her second ex-husband's attorney, had called Daniel's family home and told them something. I didn't know exactly what yet, but I knew my mother well enough to know it wasn't a compliment. I want to tell you something about Margaret before I tell you the rest, because if I don't, none of what follows will make complete sense. My mother is not a cruel woman in the way that people think of cruelty. She is not calculating in the way a chess player is. She is cruel in the way that a small fire is dangerous, not because it plans anything, but because it burns whatever it touches without pausing to decide whether it should. She had been telling stories about me my entire life. Not dramatic lies, not elaborate fabrications, small redirections, convenient adjustments. The kind of thing where someone who doesn't know you well might believe her, and someone who does know you well would raise an eyebrow but say nothing, because who wants to call a woman's mother a liar at the Thanksgiving table? She had told my first boyfriend, when I was 19, that I had applied to colleges out of state because I was embarrassed by her. She had told my college roommate's parents that I was struggling emotionally and might need help, when in fact I had a 4.0 and had just been named to the dean's list. She had told my Aunt Helen that I had borrowed money from her and never paid it back, when the truth was that my mother had borrowed $300 from me during a hard month, and I had simply decided not to ask for it. Each story had a kernel of something real in it, just enough to make it plausible, just enough to make denying it feel worse than ignoring it. And now, 1 week before my wedding, she had called Daniel's family. I put down the coffee. I picked up my phone. I typed back to Theo. "Can you tell me exactly what she said?" He responded in about 4 minutes, and I could tell from the length of his message that he had been holding this for a while and was relieved to have an opening. He wrote that Margaret had called the landline, which is the number that Daniel's parents, Roberto and Sylvia Vega, still maintained in their home in Hillsborough. She had called at around 9 in the evening. Roberto had answered. My mother had introduced herself as Caroline's mother, and then she had said, "I'm calling because I think Daniel deserves to know something. She has been hiding something from him. There is a man. There has been a man for a long time. She has a whole other life and Daniel doesn't know about it." She called him a lover. She used the word family. She said, "She has a secret family with a lover." She said, "Don't let her fool you." I read that message standing in my future mother-in-law's kitchen, and for a moment the room felt very small, and then very large, and then settled into something ordinary and cold. I thought about what it would have been like to be Roberto Vega, a 68-year-old retired high school principal who still ironed his shirts every Sunday, picking up his phone on a quiet Tuesday evening and hearing that sentence. I thought about what Roberto had said to Sylvia after he hung up. I thought about what they might have said to Daniel. I finished my coffee. I washed the cup. I dried it and set it in the rack. Then I got in my car and I drove home, and before I did anything else, I called my best friend and closest professional colleague, a woman named Priya Nair, who had been a forensic accountant a year longer than me and who had the specific quality of responding to catastrophic news with approximately 4 seconds of silence, followed by a practical question. I told her what Theo had written. She was quiet for exactly what felt like 5 seconds. Then she said, "Okay, do you know what she told them specifically, or only what Theo passed along?" I told her only what Theo passed along. She said, "All right. So the first thing we need to know is what Daniel knows and what he believes. Is he the kind of person who calls you the moment something unsettles him, or the kind of person who waits until he's processed it?" I thought about this for a real moment. I said, "He waits." And that was how I started preparing for the most specific confrontation of my life, which was not going to be with my mother, not first, and not with Daniel's family. It was going to be with Daniel himself on our wedding day, in front of every person who knew us. But first, I have to explain to you what secret family actually meant. Because my mother did not invent it completely from thin air. She never did. She always started from something true, something small and real, and then she turned it until it faced a different direction. The truth was this. I had a half-sister. Her name was Rosa, and she was 24 years old, and she lived in Durham with her son, Matteo, who was 4. Rosa was the daughter of my father's affair, an affair that had ended my parents' marriage when I was 13 and Rosa was 6. My father, a man named Gerald Marsh, who had since moved to Phoenix and remarried and kept in careful contact with both of us in the particular way of a man who knows he owes a debt he cannot fully pay, had asked me when Rosa was 19 if I would be willing to meet her. It took me a year to say yes. It took Rosa and me another year to be something other than careful with each other. And by the time I met Daniel, Rosa and Matteo were simply part of my life. Not loudly, not prominently, but genuinely. She came to birthday dinners. She texted me about Matteo's preschool drama. She had sat in my apartment and eaten takeout with me and Priya while we watched a movie and complained about bad client emails. I had not told Daniel a lie about Rosa. I had not hidden her. What I had done, and I understood, in the car on the way home, exactly how this would look if someone wanted it to look wrong, was introduce her gradually and without a formal announcement. Daniel had met Rosa at a dinner about 8 months into our relationship, introduced simply as a friend of the family. It was the truth, technically. She was family, and she was a friend. But I had not said, "This is my half-sister, the daughter of the affair that ended my parents' marriage." I hadn't said it because at that point it had felt premature, too much context for a dinner table with someone I'd been seeing for 8 months. I had planned to say it properly, fully, with the space it deserved. And then I had waited a little longer, and then a little longer again, because the right moment kept getting complicated by other things. And by the time Daniel and I were serious and engaged and planning a wedding, the delay had become its own kind of wait. My mother knew about Rosa. She knew about Matteo. She had been present for exactly one family dinner, at which Rosa and Matteo were also present, about 2 years earlier, when my father had visited from Phoenix and asked if we could all eat together for exactly one awkward and ultimately fine evening. My mother had arrived an hour late, drunk 2 glasses of wine in 30 minutes, and spent the rest of the dinner commenting on how remarkable it was that Gerald had managed to produce 2 daughters. She had looked at Rosa with the specific expression of a woman who has decided that someone else's child represents a personal insult. And she had never spoken of that dinner again to me in the 2 years since, until she spoke of it to Daniel's father on the phone. The picture she painted was not complicated. A lover, a secret family. Don't let her fool you. My mother had taken Rosa and Matteo, the daughter of a dead affair, a young woman I loved and who loved me back in the careful way that people love each other when they share a complicated origin, and turned them into evidence of my deception. She had taken my silence about the full story and made it into proof that I was hiding something shameful. And she had done it 1 week before my wedding, which told me something very specific about her timing, something I wanted to understand before I did anything else. I called her that afternoon. She answered on the 3rd ring, and her voice had the particular lightness of someone who has done something and is waiting to see if it worked. "How are you, baby?" she said. "I'm fine," I said. "I need to ask you something directly." There was a brief pause. She said, "Of course, honey." I said, "Did you call Roberto and Sylvia Vega?" The pause this time was different. Then she said, "I called because I thought they had a right to know." I said, "To know what?" "Exactly." She said, "Caroline, you have been hiding that situation from Daniel for 3 years." I said, "That situation has a name, and her name is Rosa, and Mateo has a name too." She said, "That's not the point." I said, "What is the point?" She said, "You've been keeping a secret from the man you're about to marry." I said, "I've been choosing the right moment to share a complicated family story." She said, "That's not what it looks like." I said, "I know. That's why you chose this moment to make it look like something else." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, in the tone of someone who has decided to be wounded, "I am trying to protect him." I said, "No, you are trying to stop this wedding." And she said nothing, which was, finally, something close to honesty. I hung up the phone. I sat in my apartment in the November afternoon light, and I thought about what I was dealing with, precisely. My mother had called Daniel's family with a story that was real enough to sound true, specific enough to sound researched, and framed in exactly the way that would make Daniel question 3 years of what he thought he knew about me. She had done it a week before our wedding, which was not an accident. She had done it at 9 in the evening to Daniel's parents, rather than directly to Daniel, which told me she wanted the news to arrive at him from multiple directions, with the additional texture of his family's concern. She had done it without warning me, which meant she knew I would have stopped her if I'd known, and she had done it with the specific vocabulary: lover, secret family, fool you, that was designed not to describe reality, but to activate fear. I thought about Daniel. I thought about what he must have been sitting with since the night before. And I thought about what I needed to do before Saturday, which was 6 days away. The first thing I did was call Priya back. I told her everything. Rosa, Mateo, the dinner, my father, the delay in telling Daniel, my mother's call, what she'd said. Priya listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and then she said, "So the actual truth is something you should have told him earlier, but the story your mother told is not the actual truth." I said, "Correct." She said, "Does Rosa know any of this happened yet?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "Call her tonight," and call Daniel, in that order. I said, "I need a little more time to think about how to tell Daniel." Priya said, "Caroline, you have 6 days before your wedding, and your mother has already dropped a bomb. You do not have time to think about how. You have to call him tonight." I knew she was right. I called Rosa first. Rosa answered on the first ring, and I could hear Mateo in the background banging something against something else in the cheerful, destructive way of a 4-year-old. I told her quickly and as plainly as I could. My mother had called Daniel's parents. She'd framed Rosa and Mateo as a secret family. I hadn't told Daniel the full story yet, and now I needed to fix that. There was a short silence on the phone, and then Rosa said, "Oh, Caroline," and her voice had the quality of someone who is absorbing something they understand instantly because they have lived their whole lives adjacent to the same kind of turbulence. She said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I just needed you to know first." She said, "Okay." And then she said, softer, "He's going to be fine, you know, if he's the person you think he is." I said, "I know." She said, "Call him." I called Daniel at 9:15 that night. He answered immediately. His voice was careful in a way that I recognized. Not cold, but held. I said, "I know about my mother's phone call. I know what she told your father. I need to talk to you, and I need to tell you the whole truth of something I should have told you a year ago, and I need you to listen before you say anything." He was quiet. Then he said, "Okay, I'm listening." I told him about Rosa. I told him everything. My father's affair, the marriage ending, the years of not knowing Rosa, my father's request when she was 19, the slow process of building something with her, the dinner where he'd met her, and I'd introduced her as family adjacent without being specific, the delay, the reasons I'd told myself, the weight the delay had accumulated. I talked for almost 20 minutes. Daniel didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to make my hands cold. And then he said, "Why didn't you tell me the full story at the beginning?" I said, because I thought I had more time, and then I thought the gap had gotten too big to explain without it sounding like I'd been hiding it, and then I kept waiting for the right moment, and the right moment never had the right shape. He said, so you were hiding it. I said, I was delaying something I should have said. He said, is there a difference? I said, I think so. I think one is about protecting yourself, and one is about protecting the story until it has room to breathe. He said, and which one was it for you? I said, I'm not entirely sure. Probably some of both. He was quiet again. Then he said, Rosa and Matteo. I said, yes. He said, I liked her at that dinner. I said, she liked you too. He said, is the little boy okay? I said, he's great. He's 4, and he's completely chaotic, and Rosa has absolutely no idea how she's raising such a well-adjusted kid given everything. And Daniel laughed. Actually laughed, and the cold in my hands started to ease. But it didn't end there, because my mother was not finished. I should have understood that her first call was not the full action. It was the preparation. She had spent 63 years living inside her stories, and she had learned something important about them over that time. One telling is rarely enough. You plant the seed, and then you water it. You let other people's imaginations do the growing. In the 4 days between that phone call and my wedding, my mother reached out to 3 more people. She called my maternal Aunt Deborah, the one who had always been the most willing to believe the worst about me, and told her the same story with additional embellishment. She texted my cousin Sarah, who was one of my bridesmaids, a version that included the detail that she was doing this because she was worried about me, that she thought I was in over my head and needed someone to slow things down. And most significantly, most deliberately, she placed a call to Daniel's best friend and best man, a man named Jordan Castillo, who was 36 years old and had known Daniel since college, and who, I knew from 3 years of observation, was the kind of friend who believed he was protecting his people by being skeptical of new arrivals. I found out about the call to Jordan because Jordan told Daniel immediately, and Daniel called me. It was Thursday. The wedding was Saturday. Daniel's voice on the phone was not panicked, but it had a specific quality of someone who has been sitting with a lot of new information and is trying to figure out which direction to face. He said, Jordan heard from your mom. I said, what did she tell him? He said, the same thing. A lover, a secret family. He said she mentioned a photo. I went very still. I said, a photo of what? He said, she told Jordan she had a photo of you with a man who wasn't me and Matteo, and that anyone who saw it would understand immediately. I said, Daniel, she has a photo from a family dinner 2 years ago. My father, Gerald, Rosa, Matteo, me, and my mother herself. Gerald is Matteo's grandfather. He's in his late 50s. He's been in Phoenix for years. If she's showing a photo of that dinner and calling it proof, she's showing you a picture of my father and calling him my lover. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, can you send me the same photo? I said, yes. He said, do it now. I went into my phone and I found the photo from that dinner. There were 4 of them, taken by the restaurant server, casual shots with everyone slightly mid-sentence or mid-smile, the unmistakable look of people who are at a table together out of obligation and goodwill in roughly equal measure. I sent all 4. I watched the delivered notification appear. Then I called Priya, and I told her about the photo, and she said, okay, so your mother is planning to present evidence. I said, apparently. Priya said, do you know what she's going to do with it specifically? I said, no, but she's told enough people enough things that whatever she's planning, she wants an audience. That was Thursday at 6 in the evening. My rehearsal dinner was Thursday at 7. My wedding was Saturday at 2 in the afternoon. I want you to understand what the next 48 hours felt like. Not the grief of it, not the abstract sadness of a mother who had decided her daughter's happiness was less important than some older, private grievance. That sadness was real, but it wasn't new. What I felt in those hours was something colder and more specific, the feeling of watching someone aim at you and choosing not to flinch. I had a decision to make. I could preempt her entirely, call everyone she'd spoken to, issue a correction, present the truth before she had the chance to do anything further. Or I could wait, watch where she went, and let the truth do its work in the moment she chose for it to do the most damage. Because here's what I had learned about my mother over 31 years. She needed an audience. Every story she told was designed for performance. She had never once made a move that was truly private. She wanted to be present when the damage landed. Which meant that if she was planning to do something at the wedding, she needed to be at the wedding. And she was on the guest list. I called Daniel on Friday morning. I told him what I was thinking. He listened, and then he said, "You want to let her come." I said, "I want to let her think she's going to do what she's planning. And then I want to be ready for what she's planning to do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So you're using the wedding as the place where this ends?" I said, "I think she already made that choice." He said, "Okay." He said, "What do you need from me?" I told him. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "You're remarkable, you know that?" I said, "I'm angry." He said, "Same thing, sometimes." That Friday night I did 4 things. The first, I called my father in Phoenix and explained everything. Gerald Marsh, 58 years old, quiet in the specific way of a man who has spent 15 years living with the consequences of his mistakes, listened without defending himself and then said, "Whatever you need me to do, tell me and I'll do it." I told him. The second, I spoke with Rosa for 45 minutes and we made a plan together. She would be at the wedding, as she'd always been invited to be, and she would sit in the 3rd row on my side, not hidden, present. The third, I spoke with Priya, who had been my maid of honor for 13 months, and who, it turned out, had also received a voicemail from my mother, left Wednesday evening, which Priya had not mentioned to me because she had immediately dismissed it as noise and blocked the number. Priya played the voicemail for me over the phone. My mother's voice was warm and concerned, the specific performance of a woman who has practiced sounding worried. She said, "Priya, I know you're Caroline's close friend, and I'm reaching out because I'm concerned. There are things about Caroline that Daniel doesn't know, and I think as her friend you'd want to help her come clean before it's too late. She has a whole other family she's been keeping separate, a man she sees. I think she's scared to tell the truth and she needs someone to encourage her. If you could talk to her, I know it would help. Call me back." The voicemail ended. I said to Priya, "She called you too." Priya said she did. I said, "And you blocked her and didn't tell me." Priya said, "I've been dealing with it in the way I deal with irrelevant information." I said, "That is either the most professional or the most infuriating response I've ever heard." She said, "Probably both. The 4th thing I did that Friday night was lay out everything I was going to need. The photos, all 4 of them from that family dinner, printed at the drugstore on my way home, wallet-sized and 8x10, 4 copies of each. The text message thread between my father and me from the past week, printed. A photograph of my father from his current driver's license, which he had texted me at my request, clearly showing his name, Gerald Marsh, his age, 58, and his Phoenix, Arizona address. A photograph of Rosa holding Mateo at his 3rd birthday party, which was the most obvious of the 3. It was just a young woman holding a little boy in a yard with balloons. No one's idea of a secret family. And one more thing. A letter. Not from me, from Rosa. She had written it that Thursday night after we'd talked, in her handwriting, 2 pages on plain notebook paper. It started, "My name is Rosa Marsh Delgado. I am Caroline's half-sister. I am Gerald's daughter. Mateo is my son, and he is 4 years old, and he has never met Daniel in person. But Caroline talks about him the way you talk about something that matters. I'm writing this so that, if there is ever a question about who we are in Caroline's life, there is an answer in her sister's own words." I folded all of it into a manila envelope and put the envelope in my wedding bag, and I went to bed and slept for 7 hours. My wedding morning was a Saturday in November, cold and bright, the kind of morning that makes bare trees look like something on purpose. I woke up at 6:45 in my apartment for the last time, and I lay there for a moment looking at the light on the ceiling, and I felt, with great clarity, 2 things simultaneously. That I was getting married today to a man I loved and trusted, and that something was about to happen that would either break the day or complete it. I was not afraid of either outcome. I was, if I am being honest, ready. The venue was a farmhouse property called Millbrook Fields, about 22 minutes outside of Chapel Hill, a white-painted barn and surrounding meadow that the owners had converted into an event space over the previous decade. We had rented the full property for the afternoon and evening, and it could seat 140 guests in the barn, which was what we had. 138 people plus a photographer and 2 catering staff, all gathered by 2 o'clock on that cold, bright Saturday for a ceremony that was expected to take 45 minutes. I arrived at the venue at 11 to dress and take photos with Priya and my other 2 bridesmaids, a woman named Kendall from my college years who had driven up from Charlotte, and my cousin Sarah, who had been texted by my mother and had called me Thursday morning to tell me directly, "Your mom sent me something weird. I don't know what she's trying to do, and I'm not going to play along." I'd been grateful for that phone call in a way that felt disproportionate to its brevity. But that is how it is when you've been betrayed in a slow and casual way for most of your life. A single, straightforward act of loyalty feels like a clear, cold drink of water. I got dressed. My dress was ivory with a simple long line and slightly puffed sleeves, a dress I had chosen because it made me feel like myself rather than like a performance. My hair was up. Priya adjusted my veil twice and then stood back and looked at me the way she looked at things she was trying to evaluate without sentimentality and said, "You look exactly right." I said, "I feel exactly right." She said, "Good. Because in about 2 hours, we're going to find out what your mother has in her pocket." At 1:55, the guests were seated. At 2 o'clock, the music began. I stood at the back of the barn with my father, Gerald, 58 years old, with a silver at the temples look and an expression that day of a man very aware of the weight of what he owed and very willing to carry it. And I held his arm, and I thought about all the ways this moment was more complicated than most wedding moments, and how that was all right, how I didn't need it to be simple to need it to be real. My father leaned down and said quietly, "Whatever happens today, I'm proud of you." I said, "I know." He squeezed my hand. The doors opened. I walked down the aisle toward Daniel, who was standing at the front with Jordan next to him and the officiant, a woman named Dr. Carla Simmons, who had known Daniel's family for years. And Daniel was looking at me in the way he sometimes looked at something that surprised him in a way he'd been hoping for. He took my hands when I reached him. He said very quietly, so only I could hear, "I love you, and I know what's in that envelope." I said, "All of it?" He said, "Priya told me last night, all of it, and I want to marry you more than I've wanted anything." I said, "Even knowing my mother is sitting in the 4th row on the left with something in her bag." He almost smiled. He said, "Especially knowing that." The ceremony began. Dr. Carla Simmons spoke with warmth and precision about marriage as a choice made daily rather than once, about the particular courage of building a life with someone, about honesty as the architecture of love rather than just one of its features. I listened and I held Daniel's hands and I breathed, and the barn smelled of pine and the candles along the aisle, and something almost like cold outside air coming through the high windows, and 138 people were quiet and watching. We were about 18 minutes in, past the readings and in the middle of the space before vows, when I heard it. Not loud. My mother was not the kind of person who made loud entrances. That wasn't her method. Her method was insertion. A word placed at the right moment. A paper passed to the right person. A hand on an arm. I heard from the 4th row on the left the sound of her speaking to someone adjacent to her in what was clearly intended to be a whisper and clearly was not, and I caught the word, just that one word, family. And then I heard the rustle of something being taken from a bag. Daniel heard it too. I know he did because I felt his hands tighten very slightly around mine, not in fear, but in readiness. Dr. Carla Simmons paused, just a breath, and the rustling continued, and then my mother's voice rose just enough to be heard by the row in front of her and the row behind her. "It's relevant," she said, in the tone of someone who has decided that staging a scene in public is the same as telling the truth. She said, "People have a right to know." And then something happened that I had planned for, but that was still, when it actually occurred, the most extraordinary moment I have ever witnessed in my life. Daniel let go of my hands, not in retreat, in deliberate motion. He turned to face the congregation, which caused a ripple of attention, because when a groom turns to face the guests in the middle of a ceremony, people look. Dr. Carla Simmons stepped back a half step, which I appreciated. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The inside pocket, which I had not known he was using, which Priya must have arranged with him the night before, and he drew out a photograph. It was 8 by 10, printed, and I recognized it immediately. It was one of the 4 I had printed at the drugstore. The family dinner. My father, Rosa, Matteo, my mother, and me at a round table at a restaurant in Durham, slightly mid-sentence, mid-smile, a perfectly ordinary, complicated family having a meal. Daniel held it up. He held it so the guests could see it. And then he said, in the voice of a man who is not performing but is being absolutely precise, I want to show everyone something. He waited a moment. He said, my wife has a half-sister named Rosa. Rosa's son is Matteo, who is 4 years old. Rosa's father is also Caroline's father, Gerald, who walked Caroline down the aisle today. He waited again. Then he said, this is the secret family. He turned the photo so anyone who needed to see it could see it. He said, a young woman and a little boy and a father who came from Phoenix so he could be here today. He let that settle into the room for exactly the right amount of time, which was about 4 seconds. And then he turned back to me, put the photo in my hands, and said, I'm ready to marry you if you're ready to marry me. I don't have a word for what I felt in that moment. Vindication is too cold. Relief is too small. What I felt was the specific sensation of something true being said out loud in front of everyone, loudly enough that it couldn't be unsaid. I said, I'm ready. And Dr. Carla Simmons stepped forward again and said, in a voice that I believed contained some genuine admiration, then let's continue. From the 4th row on the left, there was complete silence. We exchanged our vows. Mine were the ones I had written in November, 6 months earlier, in my apartment on a Sunday morning with coffee going cold beside me, and they were honest in a way that I had not entirely planned for them to be. They talked about choosing someone not because you know everything about them, but because you have decided their complications are yours to understand. Daniel's vows were shorter and more direct, which was exactly who he was. He said, I will not leave when it's hard. I will not decide I know everything about you before you're done telling me. And I will always be on your side of the table, even when you forget to tell me who else is sitting there. Someone in the 3rd row made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something more complicated. I think it was Rosa. And I choose to believe it was both. We were married at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Saturday in November, outside Chapel Hill, North Carolina. My mother left during the cocktail hour. I did not see her go. Priya saw her and described it to me later. She gathered her bag, put on her coat, and walked out through the side door while the guests were moving from the barn to the adjacent reception tent. No confrontation, no scene, no parting word. Just absence, which was, in its way, the most honest thing she'd done all week. I want to tell you about the reception because it was the evening I had most needed without knowing I needed it. 138 people who had sat through something more complicated than a standard ceremony and had, for the most part, decided to simply attend the joy of it. Roberto and Sylvia Vega found me before dinner, and Roberto took my hand in both of his, in the formal, careful way he had, and said, I owe you an apology. I let something worry me that I should have asked you about directly. I said, you heard something that was designed to worry you. He nodded. He said, still. I said, we're going to be fine, Roberto. He said, yes, I think we are. Rosa sat at a table with Priya and Kendall and a couple of Daniel's work friends, and Matteo fell asleep in his chair before dinner was fully served, and someone, I think it was Jordan, found a table linen to tuck around him, and he slept through the entire first course like a small, dignified guest who had simply decided he was done. Jordan came and found me during the cocktail hour, before I'd expected him to, and he said, I want you to know I told Daniel immediately when your mother called me. I didn't sit on it. I said, I know. He said, and I want you to know that I didn't believe it, not after the first 5 minutes. I said, what changed in 5 minutes? He said, I talked to Daniel. He'd already heard from his father. And Daniel's first reaction was not worry. It was anger on your behalf. So I adjusted. I said, thank you for that. Jordan said, "Welcome to the family, Caroline." He said it in the flat, direct tone of a man who means exactly what he says and doesn't embellish, and it was one of the best things anyone said to me that night. My father danced with me. It was not the traditional father-daughter moment. We had not had a traditional anything. But it was real and slightly awkward and exactly right, and he held my hand properly and said, "I think I like him very much." I said, "I know you do." He said, "Rosa thinks so too." I said, "I know that too." He said, "We did all right, didn't we? Between us." He meant Rosa and me, the two of us figuring out how to be half-sisters when no one had modeled that for us. I said, "We did." He said, "That's the thing I'm most glad of." I let him have that. What I did not do that night, which I want to be clear about, I did not call my mother. I did not send her a message. I did not ask anyone to check on her or relay anything to her. I let the silence be the response. In the weeks that followed the wedding, I learned more about what my mother had said and done in the approach to that Saturday. My cousin Sarah had kept the text message she'd received and shared it with me, with my permission, and then shared it also with Aunt Deborah, who had the complicated reaction of a woman who had believed the story in the moment and felt the specific embarrassment of someone who had allowed herself to be used. Deborah called me 2 weeks after the wedding and said, "I should have called you first." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm sorry." I let it sit, because an apology acknowledged doesn't have to be an apology accepted, and I was still deciding what I wanted to do with the relationships that had bent under the pressure of my mother's story. My mother called me twice in the first 2 weeks after the wedding. I did not answer. She left 2 voicemails. The first was a version of justification. She had been concerned. She had been trying to protect Daniel. She had not meant for it to go the way it went. She thought someone needed to know. The second voicemail, left about 10 days later, was different. Shorter, quieter, without the machinery of justification. She said, "I know I hurt you. I know why. And I don't know how to stop being what I am." I listened to it 3 times, and then I did something I had not fully planned. I forwarded it to Priya, not because I needed advice, but because I needed a witness. Priya listened to it and said, "That's the most honest thing she's said in the whole story." I said, "I know." She said, "It doesn't mean you have to respond." I said, "I know that too." What my mother had done, and I want to be precise about this, because imprecision is how the thing gets minimized, was not simply gossip. She had deliberately, specifically, strategically contacted multiple people in my life and my fiancé's life with a story designed to fracture the trust I had spent 3 years building. She had done it 1 week before my wedding, which was a calculation, not an impulse. She had weaponized real details: Rosa, Matteo, my father, the dinner, a photograph, and turned them into something unrecognizable. And she had done it without once asking me to account for myself directly, which told me that she had not been interested in the truth. She had been interested in the effect. The effect she got was not the one she planned for. In the months after the wedding, I thought often about what my mother had actually revealed. Not about me, but about herself. A woman who had lived her entire adult life rearranging the facts of other people's stories to make herself central to the narrative. A woman who had been through 3 marriages and come out of each one with a different version of events in which she was the one who had been failed. A woman whose relationship with her own daughter had always been, at its core, competitive. Not out of hatred, but out of a desperate and unarticulated need to be the one who knew more, who understood better, who arrived first at the conclusion. My happiness was not what she feared. What she feared was being irrelevant to it. What she feared was a wedding day on which everyone looked at me and Daniel and felt something uncomplicated, and she was simply a face in the 4th row. She had made herself central. I'll give her that. She had ensured that her presence was the most talked about thing in the room for 48 hours. What she had not predicted was that Daniel would be ready, that Priya would have arranged it, that the photograph would be in his pocket at exactly the right moment, and that the truth would be boring enough to be entirely harmless. A half-sister, a nephew, a father from Phoenix. That was all it was. Daniel and I moved into a house together in January, a 3-bedroom bungalow in a neighborhood called Northside in Durham, with a porch that faced east and got the morning light in a way that I found completely unreasonable in how nice it was. 1,400 square feet, a yard with one good oak tree, and a kitchen with the kind of counter space that made Priya, when she visited in February, actually audible in her approval. We set up the guest room first, before our own bedroom was fully organized, because Rosa and Mateo were coming the second weekend, and Mateo needed a room with a door that closed properly. Rosa brought a plant as a housewarming gift, something green and low maintenance that she said she had done absolutely no research on, but felt was appropriate. Daniel set it on the kitchen windowsill and said, "I'll keep it alive." Rosa looked at him for a moment and then said, "That's an extremely specific promise." He said, "I'm a specific person." She said, "Yeah, Caroline mentioned that." It was a small exchange, and it shouldn't have landed with the weight it did, except that it represented something I had not had in 6 years of cautious separation between two parts of my life. Everyone in the same room, speaking directly to each other, without me managing the borders between them. Mateo climbed on everything in the house. He found the oak tree in the backyard and requested to be lifted to touch a branch, which Daniel did, and then Mateo announced that the tree was his. Daniel said, "Noted." Rosa said, "He claims things." Daniel said, "So do I. That's my kitchen." Rosa said, "Good luck with that. There are 2 of you." I watched this, and I thought about the specific texture of a life with room in it. Room for a sister and her son. Room for a husband who reads receipts in jacket pockets and then keeps them. Room for a father who comes from Phoenix and dances slightly awkwardly and means well. Room for a best friend who blocks numbers and makes plans and stands next to you while a ceremony continues. I thought about my mother, not with rage, not with the banked cold heat that had kept me through the week before the wedding, just with the particular clarity you get when you've had some distance. My mother was 63 years old, and she lived alone in Mabane with a dog and a phone she used to call people before she'd thought about what she was going to say. She had not called me since the second voicemail. I did not know whether she would again. I had not decided what I would do if she did. What I had decided was this. I was not going to protect her version of events. I was not going to tell people it had been a misunderstanding or a moment of confusion or anything that softened the specific deliberateness of what she'd done. If anyone asked, and in the months after the wedding, several people did, I told them plainly. My mother called my fiancé's family 1 week before my wedding and told them I had a secret lover and a secret family. What she was actually describing was my half-sister, Rosa, and Rosa's son, Mateo. She knew who they were. She used them as evidence of a deception that did not exist, and that is not something I'm prepared to call anything other than what it was. People would nod, sometimes with discomfort, sometimes with recognition, and I would not rescue them from the discomfort. The discomfort was appropriate. The discomfort was information. 6 months after the wedding, my mother sent a card, an actual paper card in an envelope, with my married name on the outside in her handwriting. Inside was a card with a generic sentiment about thinking of you, and in the space below the printed words she had written, "I'm sorry for what I did before your wedding. I think I was afraid you were leaving. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know I understand what I did." It was signed with her name. Not Mom. Margaret. I read it twice. I showed it to Daniel, who read it and then held it for a moment and said, "What do you want to do with it?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "That's an okay answer." I set it on the kitchen counter by the windowsill, where Rosa's plant was doing unexpectedly well, and I looked at it for a few days, and then I put it in the drawer where I kept important papers, not because I had forgiven her, and not because I was certain I wouldn't, but because it was the first honest thing she had sent me in 31 years, and I wasn't willing to throw that away before I understood what I wanted it to mean. I was 31 years old when I got married. I am 32 now. The oak tree in the yard is bare in the winter and full in the summer, and Mateo has visited it approximately 11 times and claims it as his own approximately 11 times, with what seems like genuine surprise each time that Daniel agrees to the claim. Rosa finished a certification she'd been working on and is 3 months into a new job in Durham, and she doesn't text me about preschool drama anymore because Mateo started kindergarten in September, and the drama is now about a boy named Charles who eats her son's crackers. My father sends a card on the 1st of every month. Not for any occasion, just to maintain contact, the way a man who knows he let too much time go by might try to fill in some of the distance. Priya got a client this spring who turned out to be the most organized forensic accounting case she'd ever worked, and she called me at 8 in the morning to tell me about it with the same energy most people reserve for lottery wins. And Daniel kept the plant alive through February, which Rosa acknowledged with what I can only describe as grudging respect. He gets the morning light on the east-facing porch before I'm awake most days, and when I come down, he has coffee ready and he's reading something. And I sit next to him in whatever I slept in and put my feet on the railing, and sometimes we talk, and sometimes we don't. The quiet between us is the kind you build on purpose, the kind that requires knowing someone well enough to be silent in the same direction. I did not always have that. I have it now. My mother used a real thing, Rosa, Matteo, the photograph, the dinner, and tried to make it into a weapon. What she did not understand, what she had never understood about the real things in a life, is that truth is not fragile. Truth does not require protection. Truth sits still and waits. The story she told needed constant maintenance. New calls, new people, new urgency, the right framing, the right moment. The truth only needed one thing. It needed Daniel to hold up a photograph and say, "In front of everyone, here is who these people actually are." And it needed me to have told him enough of it the night before that he was ready to do that. That is the thing I want you to hear. If you are sitting somewhere with something you've been delaying, not a secret, but a story that deserves space and hasn't been given it yet, the delay costs you. Not because you are lying, but because the space you leave is space that someone else might fill with their version. Tell the truth in the shape it actually has. Tell it before someone else tells it in the shape they need it to have. Tell it to the people who matter, even when the moment isn't comfortable enough. The right moment is the one you make, not the one you wait for. The photograph is in a frame in our hallway now, not the one Daniel held up at the ceremony. I kept that one separate in the manila envelope in the drawer with the card from Margaret. The photograph in the frame is one from the reception. Me and Daniel and Rosa and Matteo, taken at about 7 in the evening, after dinner, when the lights in the barn were warm and Matteo had woken up from his nap and was eating something off Rosa's plate. My dress is slightly wrinkled from dancing. Daniel has his arm around my shoulder. Rosa is laughing at something out of frame. Matteo is looking directly at the camera with an expression of absolute seriousness that makes everyone who sees the photo ask who the little boy is. He's my nephew, I tell them, and then I tell them the whole story. If this story woke something in you, if at any point you thought I know this feeling, I know what it's like to have the truth used against you, to have someone you love reach into what is real in your life and turn it into something unrecognizable. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what part of this landed for you. And if you know someone who is living with the weight of a story someone else is telling about them, who is afraid that the truth is somehow not enough, share this video, because sometimes we need to see that the truth survives. It survives being held back. It survives being misused. It survives being held up in a photograph at a wedding ceremony in front of 138 people and asked, "Is this the secret family?" It survives because it is simply, stubbornly what happened. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell, because we tell stories here about women who decided that silence was no longer the safest thing. A strong hug. And remember, you do not owe anyone a version of your life that protects them from the truth of what they did.